All right. Thank you, everybody, for dialing in. My name is Barry. I'm CEO and co-founder at Ivy, calling in today from London, which is going to be our newest city. So I'm here preparing for our launch. Very excited for that. But what I'm even more excited for is the conversation we have today with Geoff Tuff, who is the head of the innovation practice at Deloitte. Geoff, thank you so much for being with us today. How are you?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. I'm great.
Okay, great. So really excited for this conversation. As everybody read already in our invitation, Geoff wrote a book that's modestly entitled Detonate: Why and How Corporations Must Blow Up Best Practices and Bring a Beginner's Mind to Survive. So what I found out recently is that actually that word detonate can't be said in airports or in US airspace. And this book couldn't be sold at airports for that reason. So Geoff, thank you for being here. Maybe we can kick off with you sharing why you thought this was a critically important topic to write a whole book about.
Absolutely. And Barry, before we scare anyone off, it's not like the book is illegal or anything. It's just that it so happens that the word detonate can't be said. So if you're reading it in an airport, best to maybe have it behind a different cover. So Steve Goldbach, who's my co-author, Steve and I started talking about the ideas behind Detonate probably about 2.5, 3 years ago, as we started to notice that in all our work with clients, both of us have been strategy consultants for a long time, and in all our work with clients, the things that they used to do to make them successful, all the different processes and the approaches they had to taking risk out of certain decisions and the approaches to doing financial forecasting, et cetera, all of it was getting in the way of actually going and doing stuff in the market that would help them fend off, and I don't want to sound too hyperbolic here, but fend off disruption from companies who were coming in and being able to compete in markets where they hadn't competed before. And so somewhat ironically, the observation we had was the stuff that had made these companies successful before were now getting in the way. And it was really difficult for the clients that we were working with, and our observation in the business world more broadly, it was really difficult to look beyond those playbooks, as we call them, to try to figure out how to compete more effectively. And we had some discussion about some ideas that I had written about in the past related to what makes a strong innovation portfolio, that we thought essentially there's a fundamental shift going on right now in terms of where the nature of opportunity is today versus where it was 3 or 4 years ago.
Got it. Fascinating. So we're very fortunate to have you here to talk to us directly about this. And my key goal for this conversation is for everybody who's a part of this conversation, myself included. I really want us to learn in a way that enables us to have actionable lessons that we can implement starting tomorrow, right? In both our businesses, but also in how we conduct ourselves in that organizational context. So want to just start with, the question of, even the title of your book is Why and How Corporations Must Blow Up Best Practices, right? And intuitively, you would think best practices are precisely the ones that should be followed. Why would corporations want to blow those up? What's changed in the world that's made you think that that's the best step forward? Yeah,
absolutely. And I will say that, Steve and I really look at almost anything in the world, in the business world, from a competitive advantage standpoint. We're always trying to figure out what will actually give competitive advantage versus not. And for a long time, it was actually okay for companies to leverage best practices either from within their industry or from somewhere else as a way to advance their business, because the world wasn't changing too dramatically. And so if you could constantly learn from others and constantly apply these best practices, you would be able to continue to advance your company. The thing is, though, when you think about what best practices are, they're generally publicly available best practices that anyone can go and apply. And if everyone has access to the same best practices, and as everyone gets better at applying the things that others have learned, they're no longer best. They are, by definition, average practices. And so the question we had is, how do you actually create real advantage in a world where the nature of change itself is changing so much more rapidly than it ever has before?
Got it. So in summary, it's all about the fact that, pace of change, when it's slower, you have time to adapt and learn and mitigate risk. But when the pace of change becomes exponential, which I guess you believe now that is the state of affairs and accelerating, then a different approach is needed. So
that I think is exactly the premise behind the book.
Got it. So can you tell us a little bit about the nature of that exponential change. So what's actually happening in the world, and
Sure.
which direction are things going in?
So what I may do, if it's okay, I'm going to start with something that actually, a piece of research that I did in an article I wrote about just over 7 years ago at this point, that was featured on the cover of Harvard Business Review, based on a very simple observation, a very simple hypothesis at the time. And the observation was that everyone knew that great innovators, people who are able to demonstrate time and time again that they can bring new value to the world. I have a very basic definition of innovation, which is the creation of new economic value. So great innovators, serial innovators, were paid a capital markets premium. They always have been, and it's kind of, people want to own your stock if you're great at creating new economic value. And so the observation we had at the time was that even amongst that top tier, there is a subset who are able to out-earn their peers in the capital markets time and time again. And the hypothesis we had is it was because they were able to structure a well-balanced innovation portfolio. And so without dragging you through all the details of the research we did, we set up a framework called the Innovation Ambition Matrix. We identified 3 different levels of ambition that any organization can have for innovation. And those are, you can innovate in your core, which is all about optimizing what you do today for your existing customers. You can stretch into adjacent spaces by changing your business model to either use new tools or use new assets to serve customers better, or to edge into new customer groups. Or you can drive what we called transformational innovation, which the way we defined it was the deployment of new capital to discover worlds that to discover needs that the world has never expressed before. So that was the basic setup, and there's lots of information on that article in the public domain. But what we discovered in the course of the research was that a well-balanced portfolio on average had 70% of the time and effort focused on driving innovation in the core, 20% in the adjacent space, and 10% in the transformational space. And for some weird reason I still can't explain, the return over a 3 to 5 year period of that balanced innovation portfolio was virtually the inverse, where 70% of the earnings were coming from those few big, bold transformational bets, 20% from the adjacent, and 10% from the core. Anyway, so without drawing pictures in the air here with my hands, if you just think about those numbers and what that meant, if 70 to 80% of the opportunity that any company has around innovation is close to your core business, I'd say you don't really need to focus that much in the adjacent and transformational spaces. Basically, if you're going to be able to optimize what you do today for your existing customers, then to your point before about linear change, you're going to be able to keep up with the markets and do things incrementally to continue to create new value. So that was 7 years ago. And I've learned a variety of different things being out with different companies, different senior executive teams talking about innovation portfolios. And I've come to conclude that number one, no one has any clue where their spend is going today. And number two, everyone way overestimates the degree to which they're operating outside the core. So when people do actually ask us to come in and look at their innovation portfolios, the most normal condition is like 95 or 96 or 97% of the innovation spend is trapped in the core. And again, there's a whole variety of different reasons for that. That was okay for a long time. And actually up until, I'd argue up until 4 or 5 years ago, it didn't actually create an existential threat if you just allowed your innovation system to be in that level of balance. But what we're living through right now is a dramatic opportunity, a dramatic shift in the nature of opportunity for any company out there. And it's because of the exponential change that you mentioned before. So I think at this point, everyone knows of Moore's law and the exponential increase in computing power that you can actually extrapolate that back through previous versions of computing to 110 years. And there's a long-term exponential curve associated with that. What we're seeing right now is that there's all sorts of new technologies that, in part because they're based on computing power, so things like artificial reality or virtual reality, nanotechnology, AI, all these things that we all read about in the business press, those things themselves are starting to show signs of being exponential. And so what that's doing to the nature of opportunity for any business out there is it's shifting it from a world that was governed primarily by risk, and by definition, risk is measurable and therefore manageable, to one that's governed by uncertainty. And uncertainty is not measurable and it's not manageable. The only way that you can add contours to something that's uncertain is to go and provoke a reaction in the market. You cannot analyze your way to a good answer. And the thing that, the thing about all of this, beyond just the cool technologies that are coming to play through these exponential shifts, is none of us as humans know how to deal with that. We're not wired to think exponentially. We're not wired to play in a world that is exponential. And I think partly on an individual basis and then partly on an organizational basis, we're just not ready to deal with that shift in opportunity.
Got it. So it's fascinating because essentially, that the framework you mentioned 7 years ago, right? It seems so counterintuitive, right? Like the 10% that's most transformational, that delivers the most value, but most people don't even know how they allocate their innovation portfolio, and they think they're doing transformational stuff and they're not. And what you're saying now is that given the way in which change is happening, the accelerated pace, it's really not so much risk mitigation anymore, where you have this balancing portfolio, but rather an uncertain environment. And the only way to navigate that is to test things out. So speaking from a relatively new organization that only started a few years ago, that's like the name of the game in startups, right? Like you have to try things out, see how the market reacts the way you mentioned. However, big corporations, they got big for a reason, right? They did a lot of things right. And where many new businesses failed, they got to, let's say, Fortune 500 status. So what are those, you want companies, like you're saying, companies have to blow up their playbooks, the best practices. What are the playbooks that they're currently using most often, and where are they falling short, so that everyone listening can kind of put it into the framework of their own business?
Yeah, and you made an important point in the lead up to that question there, which is that this is a book that was primarily inspired by really big, successful companies. Okay, and if I had to simplify it down to its essence, what we're trying to do is to take the mindset and the capabilities that come naturally to entrepreneurs and to people who have more of a disruptor status, and bring them to scaled, successful organizations. Because perhaps ironically, the really successful organizations who have a business model that's worked for 10, 20, 50, 100 years in some cases, those are the ones that are most in risk of being disrupted by people who do things differently because of that successful business model. And so, when Steve and I did the research for Detonate and we were out speaking with our clients, there were 7 areas, or 7, what we call in the book, the 7 deadly playbooks that came up time and time again as being the things that are holding companies back, or that will be holding companies back. I try to be very careful to say to any audience that these are not deadly for everyone, and every company probably has their own deadly playbooks as well. But just as an example for what we mean by these. So one of my favorites is risk management systems. So most companies have in place some version of a stage gate system. And for anyone who's listening who don't know what stage gate is, it's a conceptual framework, sometimes called stage gate, sometimes called phase gate, and there's a variety of other versions, but it's typically used to manage the risk out of new opportunity development. And what the name refers to is you have multiple different stages of development, usually 5 or 6, with gates in between those stages of development and gate reviews. And what typically happens is, and the stages go progressively from something that's very early stage and conceptual, and it may just be an opportunity space, all the way through to, in the last stage, something that you're ready to launch and go and do in the market. So what happens at the gates is you have a gate review committee who come together and they have a discussion to make a choice about what to do with the project, and you can go in one of 3 directions usually. Either you continue to move forward with it into the next stage, or you kill the project because it doesn't look like it has much promise, or you send it back to the previous stage to do the rework. And the primary mechanism they use to make those decisions is some sort of financial model. So some sort of, whether it's an MPV model or some sort of forecast for what the value of this business is going to be. That as a concept, I mean, I think most companies generally overdo their stage gate systems. They have too many meetings and they're too long and they're too boring. But as a general concept, that makes good sense if you're operating in what Steve and I call the known or knowable realm, that area close to the core business where there are real markets established already, where there are real customers you can go and ask questions to, like, would you value this if I did this for you? How much money would you pay me for it? How long would you switch to me from my competitor? And you can, in that known and knowable space, you can go and collect data to put into the financial models to have a rational discussion at the gate review. And generally things work fine. going back to my point before about the shift in opportunity, the fundamental shift from the area of the risk to the area of the uncertain is a shift from the known or knowable space where there is data you can go and collect to the unknown and in some cases unknowable space where, because markets don't exist or because people have never expressed these needs before, you cannot go and collect data to make decisions. When you apply a stage gate system to opportunities in the unknown or unknowable space, one of two things ends up happening. Either people make up the data for the gate review, and it sounds like it sounds like there's ill intent involved there, but usually they just label it a hypothesis that they're going to go back and test, but they never actually do. But they make up the data and create the delusion in the gate review that you're having a real rational economic discussion. Or they take something that could really advance the company and that is in that, you know, far adjacent to transformational space, and they pull it closer and closer and closer to the core business, to today's business, so that they can actually use data and have a rational conversation in the gate reviews. So in either one of those cases, either you're deluding yourself, you're making a good decision, or you're taking something that could have advanced the company and you're pulling it and making it incremental at best. That's an example of something that has historically worked really well in a linear world where most of the opportunities are in the known and knowable space, to something that is not only going to get in the way, but actually could end up destroying value in this world of uncertainty in the unknown or unknowable space. So that's one of the 7.
Got it. Got it. So what I'd love to do is, because I think what will be helpful, obviously I'm kind of really keen to dive into, okay, how should companies operate? But before we do that, would be great to just get like maybe a summary overview of like the full 7 deadly
sure.
playbooks, so that we get the full paradigm of like everything that may be counterintuitive. And then we'll dive into what can we do about it in the situation.
Well, now you're testing my memory of the book here. I sure hope I can name all 7. So the first one is risk management systems. The second is the strategic planning calendar and the notion that strategy needs to be revisited every single year, which presumably means that most companies believe that strategy is somehow linked to the passage of the Earth around the sun, which just feels ridiculous, but there are good reasons why that practice exists. So the strategic planning calendar, financial forecasting and budgeting as a general process in the way that that's typically managed is a third. The use of syndicated data to create advantage. This goes back a little bit to the conversation that we had before about best practices, but if you're using syndicated data that's available to everyone, you're never actually going to create any sort of competitive advantage. Traditional insight generation tools like market research studies, large-scale quant studies, focus groups, or what have you, where companies are essentially acting as if customers can tell you what they're looking for, which is no longer the case if you're working in the unknown or unknowable space, but for some reason people continue to use big quant studies to justify what they're doing in the market. That's the 5th one. The 6th one is, and this one feels a little counterintuitive to people, but the whole notion of celebrating failure, that we should be really happy if we fail at something because it demonstrates that we're great innovators, which is just in my mind, a ludicrous concept, but there is some nuance to that point. And then the final one is the belief in traditional kind of career paths through a stable organizational model. And I'm happy to go into any one of those in more detail if you want to hear more what we mean by those, but those are the 7.
Okay, love it. So those are a lot of things. Like I'm trying to imagine a company that doesn't have, you know, the financial budgeting and so forth. Yeah. So it's difficult to imagine because these are strategic planning every year. So it seems like there'd be very few people who's dialed into this conversation that doesn't experience one or many of these in their company as a way to innovate or try to innovate. So let's switch gears and let's really take a look at the kind of frameworks you've come up with, I guess, new playbooks, having detonated the old ones. What are the new playbooks that people should have in mind when they're in this environment of exponential change and the unknown, the world of unknown and the uncertainty?
Yeah. So the good news is there are no new playbooks. Steve and I often talk about the fact that it would be really ironic if a couple of guys came along to write a book about blowing up the playbooks and instead offered new playbooks to go and run. So what we talk about in the book instead are 4 aspects of a so-called detonate mindset that if you can put them in place, they will help you overcome the playbooks of the past and to advance the company. and going back to the point that we talked about at the very beginning, I think these are as actionable to individuals in their daily lives and in a lot of circumstances as they are to organizations. And so I'm happy to go through each one with a little bit of detail, or do you want to hear what they are first and then you pick amongst them? What's going to be most?
Oh yeah,
helpful?
perfect. Well, let's hear them all and then let's
Okay.
go into each one and yeah.
Okay.
Floor is yours.
So the first is to focus in everything that you do on driving human behavior. And I definitely want to come back to that one because I think that's both the starting place and the most important of the four. So one is to focus on driving behavior. The second is actually a part of the subtitle of the book, to bring a beginner's mind to most things that you do. A third is to embrace impermanence. And a fourth is to make minimally viable moves. And the way we usually talk about these, the way we organize them, are the first two have to do with thinking differently. The third and fourth have to do with acting differently.
All right, love that. So let's start from the top, focusing on driving human behavior. That seems to encapsulate a lot of things. So what specifically did you guys mean by that?
So we believe that still and for the foreseeable future, I don't care how digital a business you are, the most basic economic unit of analysis of any company is still human behavior. Okay, so, and what we mean by that is, if you think about any sort of value chain for any sort of company, again, I don't care how digitally native you might be, it's still the human beings making choices and acting in certain ways at different steps of the value chain that creates economic value. And when I say humans here, people automatically, or not automatically, but they often assume I'm just talking about customers, but I'm talking about all human beings in the value chain. It's customers, it's employees, it's suppliers, it's regulators, it's partners, it's anyone that's involved there. And the basic notion here is, and I'm going to draw a little picture in the air here, but if you imagine a performance curve, let's call that your revenue projection for the next few years. It's going up at say 1 or 2% a year. That performance curve does not change for good or bad unless someone somewhere changes a behavior. Okay, so someone has to do something differently in order for your performance to change. So the job of companies, I think, if you're a profit-seeking traditional corporation or startup or what have you, the job of companies is to, first of all, understand the human beings that are in their value chain. Second of all, to understand the relative economic value that's associated with changing any one of the different behaviors. And then third, to disproportionately align their resources to go and drive those behaviors. That's it. Like if you can do those three things, if you know the humans you need to go after, where the value is in terms of changing behavior, and then go and actually use your resources to shift those behaviors, you will be successful by definition. But if you think about what we all do in our companies day in, day out, from going to meetings or writing PowerPoint slides or developing Excel models or listening to conference calls, how much of that actually comes back to understanding and driving human behaviors? And the answer, I mean, if you think about it, I've obviously thought about it. Usually it amounts to just a very, very little bit of time relative to everything else that we're doing. We've kind of lost sight of what the overall purpose of companies should be. So that's what we mean by focus on driving human behavior.
Right. I gotta tell you, I find that pretty actually mind-blowing. It's so simple.
It
That
is.
is so true. All you're trying to do is change the behavior of people for the better. So whether any stakeholder, right? Whether it's your customer, supplier, colleagues, boss, subordinate. So it's actually driving behavior change. So I guess.
And by the way, you said there something really important. You said to change it for the better. And I think as a competitive strategist, I think of how we create advantage, how we create economic value, but you can actually do it and elevate the human experience along the way. You can actually do things that simultaneously drive higher profits and actually make people's lives better. And that's part of the beauty of being able to focus on human behaviors.
Absolutely. And I've found obviously the better someone is aligned with a particular objective and the better their human experience, it goes hand in hand. So the better the outcome, also the human experience is better and vice versa. But that changing behavior, I guess the key actionable insight I see in that is any conference call I'm going to go into, any interaction that I have with anyone associated with my organization, really in the back of my mind is thinking, okay, how is everything that I'm doing and everything that everyone is doing changing the behaviors for better? So I think that's a very powerful insight.
Please put it into practice. That's great.
I will do. Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Moving to your second one, so bring a beginner's mindset.
Yeah.
This is actually super easy for first-time entrepreneur that has no idea what they're doing. It comes very naturally. But obviously, sometimes it's extremely hard for when you build an expertise, and actually even for an entrepreneur who's been at it for 2-3 years, you kind of feel like, well, I know how these things are done. So
Yeah.
curious how you define that bringing a beginner's mindset, and how does that actually crystallize in action? And what are
Sure.
some ways to do that on an ongoing basis?
Yeah, so the concept, as many of your listeners may know, actually comes from the world of Zen Buddhism. It's something that's talked about a lot in the business world these days. Steve Jobs talked about it at Apple. Mark Benioff from Salesforce actually makes it a keynote of a lot of what he talks about. And the basic idea behind it is probably best encapsulated in a quote that my co-author Steve always makes fun of me because it's a simple quote, but I always manage to botch it in some way. So this is not going to be exactly right, but it's a quote that comes from Suzuki's book, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. And it's something like, in the beginner's mind, there are many options. In the expert's mind, there are few. And the idea here, when you try to apply it to scaled corporations and to any successful company, is for a long time, expertise has won the day. Okay, so if you think about people who sit in executive positions, who have enjoyed a long career, part of the reason that they're there and that they've had a long career is because they have some level of expertise. Expertise helps with what the dominant model of scale has been up until this point, which is scalable efficiency. Meaning if the purpose behind, and I'm going kind of meta here in terms of the idea behind companies, but if the purpose of growth is to achieve scale, and to give yourself some sort of scale advantage, usually that advantage comes from being more efficient at what you do. Either you have access to supply more efficiently than others do, or you have access to demand in a more efficient way than others do. And naturally, if you're trying to drive efficiency in your business, I mean, if you just think about cost cutting, look at ways to cut corners. If you're trying to drive efficiency in your business, then you should rely on the experts. You should rely on expertise to help make decisions, because if you can have an executive come into a room and say, I've been in this position before, we did this, here's the outcome, let's move on and do something else, that's driving efficiency. That works fine in the, as I referred to it before, the known or knowable space, where we actually know what's going to happen and we know what the repercussions of our actions are going to be. But if we're in the unknown or unknowable space, the thing with expertise is it naturally narrows the aperture in terms of the things that you will consider to go and take action on. And it's not, as you pointed out before, that's just not the way that entrepreneurs think. And so when you come new to a market with a startup, you're looking to disrupt it, or you're looking to take on the major incumbent there, you're not thinking to yourself, well, geez, I have this massive asset base that I need to go and utilize, and I'm trying to drive efficiency in my gargantuan organization, and I have to follow the playbooks. No, you're looking for the best way to go and drive an outcome by looking at it from a beginner's mind. You're looking at a problem and you're saying, geez, how can I go and make better use of all the additional housing capacity we have in people's unused apartments? That's what led to Airbnb. And that's the type of mindset that we're trying to encourage. But still, most companies are based on the notion that the experts have it right, that what we've learned in the past will continue to be true for the future, and therefore we should rely on that expertise.
Got it. So what are some practices for, like, practically speaking, other than keeping this lesson in mind, what are some ways in which, you've found it to be effective? And I'll ask it in two parts. Part one is, how do you remind yourself to have that beginner's perspective on an ongoing basis? Part two, when you're dealing with everybody else, right? And they're kind of forcing you into the box that's dictated by experience or expertise, how do you fight against the force that's trying to get you to go on the straight and narrow path?
So the first question is a lot easier to answer, I think, than the second one, because the second one is going to have some nuance depending on the organization that you're part of. But two parts to my answer to the question of what do you do in situations where you feel like you're relying on expertise? So the first is sometimes literally, this sounds simplistic, but sometimes literally bring a beginner to the table. So bring someone who's brand new to the company or has never been in this situation before and say, here's what we're facing. What do you think we should do about it? And that, by definition, is bringing a beginner's mind. It sometimes, unfortunately, leads to bad suggestions and bad outcomes. So I wouldn't recommend that in all circumstances. But the thing that we talk a lot about in the book is the power of recognizing and knowing when to challenge orthodoxy as the foundation to being able to bring a beginner's mind. And what we mean by orthodoxy is any company in the world has a set of conventional wisdom or the things that they do just kind of by rote. Sometimes they're written down as the rules of the road of how we do certain things. Sometimes it's just literally what you learn when you come into a company and into a job. You just kind of learn what the norm is when you kick off a meeting, and what does it mean to have a good agenda, and when do we need to finish the strategic planning. And we kind of fall into this routine just assuming that things are that way because it's the right thing to be doing. If we all can just pick up our heads at times and say, am I falling prey to an orthodoxy here that should be challenged? Am I doing things just by rote instead of because it's the right thing to do? That's one of the best ways to just recognize that you're falling back on expertise, you're falling back on the old ways of doing things, and it can often be a signal to go and try something different, to look at it from a beginner's point of view. And I want to be very careful as I say that to mention that not all orthodoxies should be challenged. Not all like norms that companies have are bad norms. And I happen to do a lot of work in oil and gas these days. There's a lot of orthodoxies that have to do with safety that you do not want to challenge, because when you challenge them, you put people's lives at risk. So the power in this is to simply to recognize orthodoxy and to have either an explicit conversation or at least a recognition in your own mind for when you're falling into just the routine of doing things because you kind of think that's the way it's meant to be, and say, should I challenge that? Is there a better, a more beginner-like way to look at this? In terms of your, sorry, did you want to comment on that?
No, please go ahead.
Okay, well, so the second one, what do you do when you feel the company moving towards being overly influenced by expertise, as I said, is a more difficult one to answer because some of it depends on the power of the personalities in the room. And honestly, sometimes expertise probably is the thing that we need to be falling back on. But one of the most powerful things that I've seen help move companies, help move clients when they've fallen into that routine in the past is to bring analogies and to bring examples from other types of settings, whether it's a different industry or even a different category of information completely, like the application of the notion of a beginner's mind from Zen Buddhism to businesses. But if you can bring analogies from other places to say, look, this is, what would it look like if we did what so-and-so did in that industry, because it's not the way that we've always done things or the way our competitors have done things. That usually gets people at least listening rather than saying, oh, we have to blow up everything that we've ever done in the past and be beginners at our business, because that's not the right outcome either. Got it.
So I have a really burning question about this now. So you told us, okay, there's 4 mindsets that you're recommending. 2 of them around thinking differently, 2 of them around acting differently. We're going to get into the acting differently ones, but before we do, I can't help but ask. So for somebody who is, kind of like constantly bringing up, like for a company to constantly bring a beginner's mind to something, right? The thought that kept occurring to me is like, do you need kind of like a crazy person in charge, right? Someone who will constantly just like bring that beginner's mindset, infuriate people, and like somehow then have that ability to like keep being crazy, to keep disrupting their own self and the company, while also being good at changing behavior, like driving behavior change, which was their first point.
Yep.
So just curious, like, because, you could implement this at different levels, but ultimately like the person in charge, the key decision maker needs to be very comfortable with this kind of thinking to believe like the beginner's mindset as opposed to the tried and tested in any situation.
So you are bringing up a really important point, and it's a level of nuance that's hard to do justice in the amount of time we have. But the headline is you have to be able to do both. So the reality for any sort of scaled successful company is you can't go and blow up everything that you're doing today. Most companies have big installed asset bases. They've still got a very strong cash flow. They've got shareholders that they report to. And if you start blowing up everything, then you're going to destroy value. So there's a lot of terms to whether it's being an ambidextrous organization or, there's been a lot written about how to do both things simultaneously, but you need to be able to both operate the core business using traditional tools and traditional methods, and you need to continue to advance things and to look for different ways of operating in the future. And whether it's setting up a separate structure to go and explore that unknown or unknowable space, or as I said, there's lots of mechanisms for how to do it. But in terms of the person in charge, it kind of depends on the company and the person you're talking about, but I would, if I could hazard a guess, I'd say I'd rather probably have someone who understands tradition and understands old successful business models and who is open to hearing from beginners and actually considering beginners' perspectives than the other way around. And that's mainly because if you bring in someone who is the, as you put it, the crazy person, you'll probably end up, killing the golden goose or whatever the saying is. And actually, as an anecdote, one of my favorite parts of the research that Steve and I did for the book is we sent out a call through all social media for the stuff that drove people crazy at their companies. We're looking to try to understand on a broader perspective, what are the things that people show up at work and they're involved in, and it just drives them crazy because it feels like they're wasting time and money. And one of the quotes that I think we actually put in the book and that has stuck with me is someone wrote, it really drives me crazy when I go to a marketing meeting and we have to make a decision about something, about how much to spend on some sort of execution. And we all have to sit and listen to Jimmy from finance having an idea. And no offense to any of the Jimmy from finances out in the world, but the other side effect of always calling into question, doing things traditionally, and always bringing a beginner's mind is if you get the balance wrong, you're going to drive a lot of people crazy along the way. And so anyway, establishing balance is what has to be done to make any sort of progress for successful companies viable. And that's a lot of what we talk about in the book.
Got it. Yeah, we recently hosted a conversation with Julian Guthrie, who wrote The Billionaire and the Mechanic and Alpha Girls. So she studied a lot of, both these maverick innovators as well as people who incrementally innovate and get up the value chain, food chain, whatever you want to call it. It was very interesting though, and we've hosted other talks about inside leaders versus outside leaders, people who are familiar. So I guess, the main takeaway I got from your last answer was, respect the tradition, like understand it, really get it. And then within the context of that, be willing to have this beginner's mindset. There's
Absolutely.
Probably a lot more we can talk about in this one, but for the sake of time, let's move now to the second set, the act different 2 points. So
Yeah.
The first one you'd mentioned was embrace impermanence. And that sounds very Buddhist indeed. So tell us what that means.
So this one actually is not, to the best of my knowledge, it's not pulled from Buddhism. But the notion there is that this is obvious, but nothing is forever. And especially now, as we're living through these exponential changes, things are going to change, and disruption is going to happen, and new opportunities are going to emerge much faster than we have ever experienced before, and that we've ever even thought possible. And so the thing with the notion, a belief in permanence is it governs almost everything that we do as individuals within organizations. So if you think about what the typical action for a new employee coming into a company, let's say they want to come in and they want to enjoy a long career, and there's just an embedded belief that this company could be here forever. Some people, when they think about a long career, they may think 2 years, they may think 20 years, but they think to themselves, this company is going to be stable. I want to be able to rise up the corporate ladder. I want to be able to be successful here. And so the first thing they do is they start listening for tips and tricks from those that have come from them in the past. And this is where they start to embrace orthodoxy and follow the playbooks. And when it comes time to make a marginal call on something that isn't totally clear, they usually follow the playbooks, because who's going to fault them if they're just following the things that have been successful in the past and that their mentors have told them, and they end up enjoying a long career. We draw a picture of it in the book, the virtuous cycle of success. But the thing is, in a world of exponentials, if you bring a mindset that presumes permanence and presumes that everything is going to be stable forever, then you will be blind to acting differently and challenging orthodoxy. And what will end up happening is when it comes time for that marginal call, sometimes things go really badly. Like if you miss the new entrant of a competitor coming from a different direction with a different business model than anything you've ever done before, and they take a substantial amount of your market share, chances are you're not going to get a buy in that situation. And the weird thing that happens as human beings in those situations, what we do is, instead of saying, well, geez, next time that answer came along, that went badly for me, or that when that question comes along, that went badly for me, and I'm going to go try to do something differently. We say, no, next time I'm really going to embrace the playbook. I'm really going to make sure I follow the rules. And, the bosses say, next time you make that decision, bring more data and do more analysis before you make the decision. And that then turns that virtuous cycle of success into a vicious cycle of failure. And the key thing that prevents us from looking at things differently is we assume in the back of our heads most of the time that things are forever. And so if we can embrace impermanence and recognize and it doesn't have to be like existential crises, the company's going to fall apart, but just, we don't need to keep in place the same structures, the same belief about what a team does for a certain function indefinitely. Then we can start to shift to new operating models. There's been a lot of work recently on what the future of work is going to look like. And one of the aspects of effective future workplaces will be fit for purpose teams, where you can assemble a team based on a variety of different skills to get a job done, and then that team gets disbanded. And so that's what, at a much more practical level, that's what we think the application of embracing impermanence will look like, where we don't presume that things have to stay stable and that things that basically, organizational charts and career paths will be around forever. And instead, we're trying to focus more in the moment on what actually is going to drive success.
All right, got it. So it's all about really actively, proactively bringing to the fore that, like, yeah, this all looks good, but it's not going to last forever anyway. And like bringing that mindset into every strategic decision that's going to be made. So it's almost like, instead of saying, oh, something happened, something changed, and therefore we have to change, it's also even the things that are just fine, bringing that kind of a mindset that, well, that too will pass. So what do we do next?
Yeah, and it's mainly because what worked in the past, what led us to success in the past, just may not be the thing that leads to success in the future. And that's really the essence of impermanence. Is we don't believe that there is a slow and steady progress that will follow a predictable path, which is more of the permanence mindset. We are always wondering, what could change, what will change in a way where we need to actually not do things the way that we have in the past in order to be successful.
Yeah, and as you said earlier on in the call, if 70 to 80% of additional value is created from the 10% of things that are completely outside of the scope and of the core business, that's the research that I guess proves this point, which is that even the stuff that does work, even if it keeps working, it's not necessarily going to be the place where you really get to the next level on scale. All right, awesome. So final one of the 4 mindsets: make minimally viable moves. What do you mean by this?
Yeah. Well, so this is just, many people know and practice and have thought about so-called minimally viable products. So this is just a twist on that same notion. So for any of your listeners that don't know about MVPs or minimally viable products, typically they are, in a product development process, you take the smallest incremental step forward in a product development, and then you put it in the market to see what the reaction is going to be. And if it looks like it's a positive reaction, then you continue on down your development path. If it looks like a negative reaction, you go a different direction. The very same concept can be applied to any sort of management move, whether you're talking about a new product development or a new incentive system. You can break things down into their smallest testable components and put them in the market. Sometimes it's an internal market, to get a reaction from people before you continue to advance things. And the notion behind this is that, again, we're working in this realm of uncertainty where increasingly it will be hard to predict what the outcomes are going to be. So the old ways of operating, which are all about analyzing and coming up with airtight arguments for why a certain thing is going to happen based on past experience, we're now essentially saying, look, we don't know what's going to happen, so let's try to move as quickly as possible with the smallest possible step forward and continually course correct. So this goes back to the deadly playbook that I talked about before, related to celebrating failure, which in my mind is just an excuse for being sloppy. You only fail if you wait, and failure here is, let's call it just roughly, the exposure to significant either financial or reputational risk. So you only fail if you've waited too long to go and do something. And so you will not fail almost by definition if everything you do is about testing small things and slowly moving forward and trying to see what is going to happen in the market before you then take the next step and course correcting along the way, which by definition is a mode of constant learning. We used a metaphor in the book about imagining being in complete darkness walking through the woods one night, and the most successful way to get through the woods. You wouldn't go and either run or take huge steps and do things with great confidence, you'd probably edge a foot forward to see if you're going to run into a stick or a log, and if you run into something, you go a slightly different direction. And that's notionally what we're talking about here in terms of making minimally viable moves in everything that we do.
Would you caveat that though by also saying that when you've done those minimally viable moves and it's pointing in the right direction, sometimes it is called for then to go nuclear on that, okay, it is working, and now we're going to go all in and shift the direction of our business. Because obviously, a lot of the greatest business or wartime stories, they're not necessarily the incremental shifts, it's the Hail Marys, right? Like the big audacious move. So I just wanted to see like what you thought of like, yeah, it's extremely wise to have small experiments that can cause you a reputation or financial ruin just because you experimented with something.
Yeah.
But once an experiment is shows its worth, then are you a proponent of leadership that says, now we go all out?
So once again, you're getting into like the 201 version of some of the stuff we talk about, but the answer is yes. And so the way I think about this is, and I wish I could draw a picture for you, because it's a picture in the book where we map out what the area of uncertainty is, and the unknown and unknowable space, and what the area of known and knowable space is. So what you're doing when you're making minimally viable moves is you're working in the uncertain realm. And what you're trying to do is, I think I used this phrase before, is add contours to what that uncertain realm is. At some point, you add enough contours that it's no longer unknown or unknowable, it's known. And that's where you have enough data to go and actually do something at scale. So if we pull it back to the old product development world, once you've developed enough MVPs and gotten enough market data on a brand new offering for the world, and you've gotten enough of a positive response, that's when you launch and try to scale the thing. But you don't try to do it at obviously in the first stage of development.
Got it. So very simply put, you're in that unknown zone, uncertain zone, when you don't have the data. But everything you do there should be minimally viable moves to get you that data. Once you have the data, you're no longer in that zone. Therefore, the old playbooks can work at that stage. So
precisely, yeah. And what you're doing, I mean, you are trying to create a dynamic system here where no one wants to have to operate a company in perpetuity in uncertainty. So what you're trying to do in applying all of these ideas and all of these mindsets is take something that sits in the uncertain space and make it more knowable. Make it something that you can actually act with confidence on. And to your point, sometimes that means you can fall back on the old playbooks, but only once you've made it knowable.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much, Geoff. We're going to switch over to audience questions now. We're definitely went a bit over on our part, but fascinating conversation. Thank you for the incredible answers. So everybody listening, highly encourage you to type in a question in that Q&A box in the middle center, and write please under your own name so that I can call on you to ask the question directly. However, the first couple of questions we got were sent anonymously, so I'm going to just read it out, Geoff, real quick, and let's do these like quick fire round, right? So lightning round. So one question, this member said that, first of all, furiously taking notes here, guys. Incredible conversation. Thank you, Geoff. So the question starts that way. And then the question is as follows. What is an example of a dire warning you should share with a company that is very much set in the way of this is how it's always been done mentality, and to leverage the talents of a current staff who has knowledge and expertise in the area of transformation and change agency to establish a business case for perhaps developing that type of beginner's mindset role within the organization? So in short, how do you make your voice heard? You're not the CEO, but you can see this fatal trend. How do you get the company to wake up?
Yeah. Well, so one of the best ways to get people to move, I talked before about the power of analogy, but storytelling helps too. And, at this point, I think some of the old stories of great companies that went completely under because they followed orthodoxy or missed an obvious opportunity are reasonably well known. But something in the way that the beginning of that question was phrased made me think of Kodak and what happened to Kodak way back when they, as I think most of the world knows now, they invented the digital camera. But they just chose not to invest in it because of the traditional business model that Kodak had and the fact that they made most of their money from film. And if you went and invested in a digital camera, then you destroyed that whole business model. But so one way, and I wouldn't suggest to your listeners that they should just go out and trumpet the story of Kodak and how it fell apart, in part because it's a well-known story at this point, but in part because it may not feel applicable to every single company. But understanding situations, and this is where this storytelling point kind of ties to analogies, but understanding situations either in your industry or elsewhere where you can draw that analogy and point out what happened not just to the company, but to the individuals involved in the company, and to start make this to make this feel more human to people who might actually then start to see themselves in that same story playing out at their company. That's where you get people to start paying attention. And similar to why I was saying before that you can't really rely on the expertise of the past in order to move forward. You can't necessarily just go and challenge. You can't go and challenge the leaders of a business who have been really successful and are probably very wealthy and very self-assured. You cannot challenge them by saying your company's going to fall apart if you don't do this, because they're not thinking about it at an individual basis. So anything you can do to individualize it and to bring those stories into the company is a step forward. I feel like I didn't do that whole question justice because there was a lot in there, but that's at least one idea is to think about how to tell better stories.
Got it. Yeah. So instead of point people to a story that gets your message across, basically, is a great one. And by the way, before you said it, Kodak was the company that was going through my head. So
yeah. Well, and the thing I'd add to that is, one of the norms in most companies is that they operate based on logic and data. And I mean, that's just how people have managed risk out of decisions forever. But by definition, there is way more data about the past and based on what has happened already than there is about the future. I mean, it's a truism that there's more information about what's already happened than there is coming. So if the only thing you rely on is logic and data and analysis to shift companies to do things differently looking forward, then by definition, all you're doing is relying on the past. And you get yourself in this kind of this loop where it's literally impossible to think about how to do things differently unless you break that orthodoxy of relying on data and logic to make decisions, and instead do things like rely on storytelling and stories and human actions to get to a different place.
Got it. Thank you very much, Geoff. We just had a question come in from EJ, so I'm going to have him loop in and ask his question or her question. It's acronyms EJ. EJ, would love for you to ask your question.
Can you hear me, guys?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Okay. Yeah, based on your experience, what is the best way to embrace uncertainty and not use it as an excuse to fall back into the best practices and things that are already been working for a long time?
So the best way, and EJ, do you mean for leaders or for people within the company, employees, or both?
Yeah, for people within the company.
Yeah. So one of the things that we really encourage almost anyone in a successful company to do is to think of ways to ask different questions and to ask better questions in whether it's in a meeting setting or one-on-one discussions. If you think back to the interactions you've had in your company, presuming you work for a company, probably that the nature of the conversation and the nature of the questions that you talk about are kind of the same. Like, there's a highly stylized version of that, which is that almost every senior executive conversation ultimately comes down to, so what's the ROI? What's the return on investment for making this move versus another move? But if you can change the question to be more about, say, one of the principles that we talked about before, and ask, for example, not what's the ROI, but what's the return on behavior? What is the return on shifting this behavior versus that? By definition, you're shifting the dynamic, you're shifting the relative importance of what we're working with, and it will allow you to operate more in that uncertain realm and to try to think about things differently and look at things differently. But it really does come down to understanding the norms in terms of the questions that are asked and answered in any sort of situation. Does that help, EJ? You may have been trying to ask something a little bit different, but that's definitely one trick.
Yeah, I think just changing the frame of the question that might help. That makes sense. Yeah.
Okay, good.
Thank you
Thanks
very
for the
much,
question.
EJ.
Yeah.
Thank you, Geoff. All right, we're going to go over to Marwan, who has a question. Hey, Marwan.
Hello, can you
Hi,
guys hear
Marwan.
me? Hi.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much. First of all, I really appreciate the conversation between both of you. It's really inspiring in so many ways.
Good.
And I kind of totally, as an entrepreneur, as an accountant, I totally understand what you guys are talking about. And I mostly struggle sometimes with making that informed, well-educated decision as I go on testing either minimum viable products or even what's the next best creative strategy for an ad online. I totally get it, but in terms of corporates and bigger corporate companies, do you think that shift in the past 3 to 4 years is mainly because the R&D started to prove itself as a value driver for growth? And if that's the case, or not the case actually, is it maybe because corporates are failing in adoption rates when it comes to newer technologies and maybe newer strategic initiatives because of rigid structures and anti-creativity kind of mentalities and attitudes in companies, in well-developed corporations? Is that the reason, really?
Well, so I definitely say that's part of the reason. And you're obviously touching on what could be a very expansive topic here, but part of the reason is that companies are not moving fast enough to adopt some of these exponential technologies to do things differently. And one thing I'm usually careful to point out to people is that exponential, when I talk about exponential change and the different exponential technologies that are out there, most people presume that I'm referencing the potential for disruption and all the negative, dangerous, terrible stuff that might happen if we don't get on board. But the flip side of that is there's a ton of really interesting, great advancements where we can be the disruptors. We can go and do things differently. And as scaled corporations with successful business models and stable cash flows, we should be better able to disrupt industries and to do things differently. We should be able to do that than the much, much smaller and underfunded companies. And so part of it is just not, companies not taking on board these technologies. But I'm a very strong believer in the power of business model innovation broadly. I think it's too narrow a scope to just focus on the application of technologies or to just push on your R&D lab when you want to go and do things differently in the world. The real power of innovation comes from where you can pull multiple different levers simultaneously in your company to enact new business models and new ways of operating in the world. And so I'd say yes, it's about technology, but it's also about all the other business functions as well that can be part of the innovation equation.
Thank you very much, Geoff, and thank you, Marwan, for that question. All right, so to help us wrap up now, I want to do the following. Geoff, first of all, you've been incredibly generous with your time, and as an Ivy thought leader who's a dear part of our community, we really want to also support you in your endeavors. So to help us wrap up, if you could share with us, first of all, how we can best support you in your endeavors, that would be great to hear. And then the second one, there was 2 questions that came up that we didn't get a chance to cover, but maybe in your summarizing thoughts, maybe as a parting piece of wisdom
Sure.
and advice, if you could share with us, you mentioned something about traditional career paths not applying anymore, and you kind of flew past that. And obviously a lot of people listening were like, what does he even mean by that? So yep. In answering that question, any kind of key career advice you would give to people when it comes to this massively accelerating pace of change in the corporate world and everything that means for corporations surviving and thriving and the people who are helming them. So yeah, over to you. How can we help you? And what's your last piece of advice? Sure.
So I'll land on the how you can help me piece, because it is a bit of an appeal that I'd like to make to everyone. But I hope this doesn't sound too simple, but in your careers, focus on experience or experiences and skills more than positions. Okay, it sounds, I think, dead obvious to a lot of people who come into companies where they're trying to gain some experience, but the average person, especially if you're in a successful scaled company, doesn't end up thinking, what's next for me in terms of the experience path? They think, what is next for me in terms of the job I'm going to take on or the role that I'm going to take on? And it's very easy to get trapped in the mindset of believing that the structures that are in place today are going to be there forever, and I can set my sights on a VP role 15 years from now, and all of a sudden have that evaporate when the company dramatically shifts strategy or whatever the case may be. But if you can focus your life in work and outside of work on accumulating experiences that together will make you a more relevant team member, that is going to set you in much better stead for what the future of work and the future of the corporate world is going to feel like in the future than if you focus on becoming that VP or becoming that CEO. So again, a lot more to be said on that, but that's my piece of advice there. The appeal I'd make to anyone and everyone in Ivy is, first of all, connect with me. I'm reasonably active in the social world, and I'd love to be connected, more connected to this community. But more than anything, tell me your stories. So we can only continue to get ideas out into the world as we hear about the stories of individuals and what's been successful and hasn't been successful. If you choose to try to apply some of the ideas from Detonate, please tell me what works, what doesn't work. I don't know if I can help you if things haven't worked, if you try to apply them, but I really would like to hear the stories, not just of applying Detonate, but what you observe out in the world in your business lives that are getting in the way of continual success. Because I believe that Steve and I, at some point, hopefully at some point soon, we'll be writing another book, and I'd love to include some of your stories in that.
Absolutely, Geoff. Thank you so much. So we'll definitely encourage everybody who dialed in now or hears us subsequently to connect with you, to share their stories with you so that you can keep innovating. I can say for myself, this was an incredibly impactful conversation.
Right.
I told you at the beginning, I want people to kind of go to sleep and wake up and change their behavior. So the 3 ways I'll be changing my behavior for what it's worth. One is really keep in mind that everything that I'm doing and everything everyone on my team is doing is all about changing behaviors for the positive outcomes. To know that when you're in the unknown zone, all you're trying to do is get the data necessary to then go all in onto something that actually works. Mm-hmm. And finally, if you only rely on logic and data, you're only relying on the past and not enough on the future. So I think those 3 things are things I will probably incorporate every day in some shape or form going forward. So thank you for
I'd
this.
say that's both a pretty good summary and a pretty good list of to-dos. So thanks for listening so carefully.
Absolutely, Geoff. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to hosting you again. And thank you everybody for dialing in.
Thanks everyone.
All the best.